Today we're looking at Lorraine Hansberry, the African American playwright who produced a play called A Raisin in the Sun. Um, an interesting play. That's the play that we're focusing on, and it's a play that was the first African American woman, uh, written by the first African American woman to have a play written for Broadway, and it had a remarkable run. It remains a perennial classic in African American theater and frankly in American theater. And it's had multiple revivals over the years. It's had a broad and expansive history. What I will do today, though, is talk a little bit about Lorraine Hansberry first, and talk about her, a very interesting writer and personality, who tragically died fairly young, just when her career as a playwright was exploding. She died of cancer. Um, and she's an interesting figure because, of course, there have been some compelling ways in which she is embraced, of course, as a genuine activist, as a political figure. She's also interesting because many, in terms of the LGBTQ movement, there's a clear argument about um, her lesbianism and her becoming an advocate of lesbianism. Although evidently Lorraine Hansberry, in her own private letters and her own private notes, which were never available until 50 years after her death, she describes her desires. She says she's attracted to women and so on, but she also recognizes the challenge of it. So we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s, and early 60s, and a very complicated time for the experience of gay and lesbian people. And Hansberry was among that group. And we know that, as we know, Hansberry was married to a man, of course, and that relationship eventually ended in divorce, but they remained real partners. He was a theater person, a director, Nimrov, I think his name was, and their partnership created a lot of support for themselves. He was also a musician, and a songwriter who had a certain amount of success. On her death, he controlled her papers, and he deposited her papers with the New York Public Library, and put a moratorium on that work. For it to be not to be open, her private notes, her letters, and so on and so forth. And then he continued to also do a few productions, created productions based on her writing, that actually had success on Broadway as well. So they had a professional relationship that persisted after the death, even after their divorce. The interesting thing, and it's relevant to A Raisin in the Sun, is that Lorraine Hansberry came from a very activist African American family, a traditionally activist African American family. She was, of course, born in Chicago and grew up in Chicago. Her parents, her father was a successful real estate agent. Her mother was a teacher and also became a political figure in local politics in Chicago. She grew up a middle class African American woman. Grew up in a house that was rich with all kinds of people coming through there. W.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, all of these writers would come through that home. And so she had encounters with some of the great political figures of that time as a child, as a woman growing up. And there's a famous case which is really, I think, at the heart of what Raisin the Sun is starting to look at, because Lorraine Hansberry becomes very, very sensitized to one of the great tragedies of American life, racial life, which is the redlining laws, the laws that were pretty much Jim Crow based laws that in terms of where people could live, where people could purchase homes, and so on and so forth, were driven by racist segregation rules, and essentially, for years, communities could segregate, could discriminate by blocking people from purchasing homes in places that they wanted to maintain as whites only and so on. And Chicago was notorious for that. Chicago, from the beginning of the 20th century, when the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to Chicago was taking place. That great migration, one of the things that the city of Chicago did was that they identified a very small, geographically small area where they would guide and direct and limit African Americans. It's the South Side of Chicago, which is now famously known as the South Side. And what they did was they controlled all the rents there. And in fact, what Raisin in the Sun teaches us is that for people who had to live in those segregated areas, their rents were even higher than the rents for the so-called nicer areas where white people were allowed to live and white people were allowed to rent. And African Americans were prevented from renting from those places. So in a sense, some of the things that we talk about, urban blight and urban challenges in a place like Chicago and in urban cities in America, some of it was created because of segregational rules, and real estate rules and city planning rules that existed. Hansberry was aware of this. Why was she so aware of this? Because her father attempted to purchase a home in a traditionally white area on the south side of Chicago, and they were blocked from doing so. So they took it to court, and there was a major court case in which this was debated. The case challenged, questioned, the decision questioned those segregation laws, but not fully. And so it was a partial win for them, but it certainly brought to light the segregation practices of America, the redlining segregation practices of America. In a case that followed after that, that redlining was deemed illegal. And of course, this is where we are today, where segregation as a means of determining or preventing people from purchasing or even living in areas is perceived as and understood to be illegal. Hansberry was, in other words, Hansberry grew up in a house in which that question was raised and had to deal with it and watched her family deal with it. Hansberry would eventually move to New York. And in New York, she worked in Harlem. She worked with a newspaper. She was a journalist. And she worked with really interesting people like W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, who were major figures at the time. And she edited a publication, a newspaper that was busy and committed to the work against racism and discrimination and so on. And she was very well known for the work that she did there. And it's while she was in New York that she became more and more interested in writing for the stage and began to write sketches and plays for the stage, and would eventually write a play that would lead to A Raisin in the Sun, which was released in 1957 on Broadway. With incredible success, starring some of the great black actors of the time, and then went on to be made into a film. Hansberry also wrote a couple of other plays, one other play that was staged on Broadway that had moderate to decent success, and seemed really poised to be one of the great playwrights that would emerge in the 50s and the 1960s and 70s. She was also a political activist who, was involved in challenging the political status quo in America. She had opportunity to meet with Robert Kennedy and to debate with him and so on. I want to say that there are a number of people that were friends of Lorraine Hansberry, and Hansberry was literally understood to be truly one of the great voices amongst people like James Baldwin, a friend of hers, Nina Simone, Maya Angelou. All of these people had relationships with Lorraine Hansberry, and regarded her as a very important voice and as a very important activist and person. There's a great song, "Young, Gifted, and Black," to be young, gifted, and black, written and performed by Nina Simone. which is based on a speech that Lorraine Hansberry made, and then of course Lorraine Hansberry used that speech, that phrase in the speech to title her autobiography, and it's exploring the question of the beauty, the power of being young, gifted, and black, and the power of being black amongst that circumstance. So that's Lorraine Hansberry, and of course I want to suggest that when we start thinking about the play itself, which is where we'll go to next, it's good to understand that she was writing out of an experience of understanding the life in Chicago of African Americans and the core racism that surrounded that life.